Morning, everyone. Good day. You know, some of our founders' habits and traditions are a little strange to us, like the keeping of slavery, for instance, but there are some others too, and dueling is another one. Now, several of our founders have died in duels. And I thought we'd discuss this a little bit today. There was a booklet of sorts written up in I think around the 1820s, and it had to do with the proper procedure of duelings, the purposes for it, things like, for instance, if one would disparage the name of a lady, you could be a subject to a duel. But there are other reasons too. And we've had several duels that had to do with our founders. So I thought we'd start with them. Button Gwinnett, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he got into an argument with Lachlan McIntosh. And they fought a duel at 12 paces. So they line up back to back, they'd march 12 paces, and they'd turn and fire. Both were wounded. Ironically, this was at the plantation, the Wright plantation, of the royal governor. Well, Mr. Gwinnett did die of his wounds the next day. And this is just one example. And you kind of wonder, why would you go through all this? But usually, nothing ever happened in a duel. Because somebody would shoot in the air. It was a gentlemanly thing to do. And you'd generally be forgiven by the other person. And you would just move on with it and settle. It was a way of settling your differences. So let's talk for a moment about another of our duels. And I want to talk about Richard Dobbs Speight. And Richard Dobbs Speight is right here signing the document. Okay, he's from North Carolina. And he was elected as a member of the House of Representatives. He was elected as a Federalist, and time went on, and there was the Alien Sedition Acts. He was very opposed to them because he thought it violated our First Amendment of free speech. And I know I've mentioned the Alien Sedition Acts before, and Madison and Jefferson were deathly opposed to them, and in fact ran for office on a campaign of getting rid of them. But he was an elected Federalist. John Stanley, he was a political opponent of his. And they ran articles against each other in the paper. And one of the things that John Stanley said about Mr. Speight was that he was a traitor to his party. Okay? Because he was elected as a Federalist, and yet he was aiding the Jeffersonian Republicans, or Jefferson's Republican Party. And that was a real problem to him. So after the election was over, the words just didn't seem to end. And Mr. Speight challenged Stanley to a duel. Now, this duel was held in front of hundreds of people, hundreds of onlookers. And it went on for 4 rounds. And they were fighting with smooth bore pistols. And the first round went by and they both missed. So they reloaded, and you have seconds reloading for you. And his second, I believe, was Randolph. And so they reloaded. And they took another round and another shot, and it nicked his collar, nicked Spate's collar. And at that point, the crowd was starting to turn on the duelist. They're like, now, come on, guys. This is enough. And they wanted him to stop. They begged him to stop. But Mr. Spate said he still wanted satisfaction. So they loaded again. And that round, he lost a piece of his ear. Still, they were insistent to continue the duel. And in the fourth round, Spate was struck in his side, and he was mortally wounded. 23 hours later, he was dead. This duel is really what set apart laws against dueling. Because here we had an important politician who died in a duel. And so there were laws passed to eliminate dueling. Alexander Hamilton had an affair. And he was paying hush money. Some of the House members found out about it, and they confronted Mr. Hamilton and said, now, what's going on here? There's a lot of money being exchanged here. And he showed them through letters that he had that he was being blackmailed. And that seemed to smooth it over, and it was kind of hidden under the rug, and nobody discussed it anymore. A few years later, somebody got wind of it, and it came up in the papers. So Alexander Hamilton, believing it was James Monroe that outed him, challenged him to a duel. And he chose Aaron Burr as his second. Now, one of the important things that seconds have in a duel is to try to smooth things over, try to let the whole thing go so you don't have a duel to begin with. And that's exactly what happened between Hamilton and Monroe. His second got involved and inverted the duel, which is kind of an interesting thing when you think about what was to take place later. In the election of 1800, the House was deadlocked. It was a tied vote for presidency. It was basically the Republicans had won, and Aaron Burr and Jefferson were deadlocked. And they went through a dozen votes or so. I can't remember the exact number, but it was in excess of a dozen votes, and they couldn't come to terms. Hamilton interceded with the Federalists and convinced some of the Federalists that, hey, we should support Jefferson. Between these two guys, that's the best we can do. So Jefferson became president. Aaron Burr was ignored through the presidency. And Jefferson really didn't want anything to do with him. And so he was upset with Hamilton because Hamilton had basically been a kingmaker to make Jefferson the president of the United States. So the election of 1804 came, and knowing that he would not be chosen as a running mate, he decided to run for governor of New York. So Aaron Burr ran for governor, and once again, Hamilton opposed him. Now, this is the whole reason behind the famous Burr-Hamilton duel. Okay, so he demanded satisfaction. And across the river from New York, in Weehawken, New Jersey, is a famous dueling grounds. They had 18 duels there. Hamilton's son had died in a duel there just 3 years earlier. But they decided they were going to have a duel there. He challenged him to a duel. And on July 11th, 1804, both of them came across the river separately in different boats, each taking a different second. Hamilton chose Pendleton as his second, and he brought a doctor. David Noosick. Okay. Burr brought William Van Ness. Both of these seconds were sitting judges. Now, what's interesting about that is it was illegal in New Jersey and it was illegal in New York. So, in order to give them some kind of deniability, they put the guns in a kind of a duffel bag and put them in the boat. They were borrowed from a family friend of Hamilton's. So they came across the river, and Burr arrived first about 6:30 in the morning, and the fog is hanging pretty thick. It's not very good visibility. About 20 minutes later, Hamilton arrives. And because Hamilton had been challenged, he got to choose which side that they would be fighting from. And Hamilton chose a spot where he would be not shooting into the sun. So Burr had to fire into the rising sun. Immediately, he had written things, Hamilton had, that he was going to throw his first shot away. Now, these pistols had a spring trigger on them, a hair trigger. And they were 2 shots. So each one had the ability to fire twice. The seconds wouldn't even look at what was going on. They turned their backs because they wanted to be able to say, I never saw anything. And this was what was important, and this is why there are some slight variations of the story of what happened. The shots were almost instantaneous. Hamilton had shot, as he had said, he threw his shot away 10 feet high, and I think it was 6 or 7 inches off to the right. And he hit a cedar branch and it lodged into the tree. Burr had been practicing, and his intention was to kill Hamilton. He had said later that if it weren't for the sun, he would have shot him right in the heart. The Burr did aim at him, and he hit him in the abdomen, and he fell. He fell and was caught by his doctor, and he said, "This is a fatal wound, doctor." And he passed out. They carried him back to the boat. And they applied some smelling salts, and he came to, and he warned him. He said, the gun's still loaded. But this was loading from the second shot, that there was still a shot. So he's telling them to be careful. So they went back across the river, and he died from his wounds the next day. Aaron Burr, believing he was in trouble, he fled. Warrants were out for Aaron Burr for murder because they weren't supposed to be fighting a duel. It was illegal. So both New York and New Jersey sought warrants for his arrest. Now, just so you get an idea here, I mean, earlier we were talking about Sprate and his duel, and I pointed out Mr. Sprate over here. But Hamilton is here, okay? His opponent is not here. But Mr. Pierce, Butler Pierce, is behind in the third panel, behind the black arm outstretched. That is Pickney's arm. And behind him is Pierce Butler. You don't see his face. It's kind of hell, but that's Pierce Butler. And that's where Aaron Burr went. He went down to North Carolina and hid out on his plantation. And he used the name of Roswell King. Roswell King was an overseer, and he was hiding out down there, trying to get out of the predicament that he was in. He was eventually let go of the crime and later tried for a grand conspiracy that he was trying to steal land and overthrow government out on the frontier. But Pierce Butler, he had been elected first as a Federalist, then as a Republican, then he was an independent. But after hiding out Aaron Burr on his plantation, his career was completely destroyed. He couldn't be elected again. And he wound up keeping an overseer in charge of his plantation, and he moved up to Philadelphia. And he would come down to his, he had a number of plantations, he would come down and he would check on these plantations well into his ripe old age. But the whole idea of these duels and it becoming illegal, and illegal for a reason, here we lost 3 founders. We lost a signer of the Declaration. We lost Richard Dobbs Speight, who was an important North Carolinian, and he had been very active in the Constitutional Convention. And we lost Hamilton. Hamilton was the only signer from New York of the Constitution. So all these bitter debates that went on and wound up causing the death of 3 founders, which is one of the reasons it's illegal today to duel. I just thought you'd find it interesting. And we'll talk again on the next Constitutional Talk. You have a good day. Bye.